Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and a big greeting to podcast listeners today. Just for a change, I'm going to get a bit stroppy and a bit angry about something that's happening in higher education. Isn't that a surprise for regular listeners? But of course, when I go to that stroppy, scary place, I very rarely go alone. So today, on this stroppy, scary journey, I'm going to take Professor Steve Redhead with me. And so what are we going to talk about, Steve? Well, we're going to talk about something that's disturbed me for 2 decades, really, and I'm damn angry and I'm just not going to take anymore. I want to talk about research ethics, and I want to talk about research ethics committees. So, Steve, let's start with the basic question. Obviously, you've got your disciplinary expertise from law and criminology and sociology and so forth. I'm more on the high humanities side. But for podcast listeners, could you provide a basic definition, if you will, of what are ethics and why are they important to consider in a research project?
I can, but I think it's a really difficult question. And one of the reasons why it's a difficult question is that it's almost being ironed out of history as ethics committees actually become something else. The idea of ethics as an area, if you like, and ethics committees as an organised administrative function, was really to do with looking at possible ways that you could control the problems that might be generated by research, by empirical research.
Yes, it was predictive and assistive, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. That was certainly in my case when I first started doing my PhD in the 1970s. And I've been on a lot of ethics committees in different institutions in different countries. I've been on Charles State University's Faculty of Arts Ethics Committee in the last year. And I think what I see is a great change and a series of warnings for us all, I think, in the development of what is ethics, for a start. But it often has certainly been in the past an issue to do with, is there some kind of sort of moral problem with the research that's being proposed? And I think that we'll see that we've moved, in fact, from that to a much more kind of what Steve Hall and Simon Winlow to his side have called risk management as an issue. So how have we moved from ethics and, if you like, moral philosophy issues to the issues of risk management? I think that's what we want to talk about.
Yeah, and I think perhaps some of that has emerged, Steve, because, I always used to think about ethics as do no harm. So an ethics committee would be assessing, are you harming anybody through this research?
Yes.
So there would always be this...
Including the researcher.
Yes, there would always be this little checklist in my mind. So, are you engaging humans? So are you actually dealing with real human beings? Could your research hurt them? So, for example, say you're investigating obesity and you're going into Weight Watchers and you're asking, well, how do you feel being fat? Well, there's a morality there. You're hurting somebody through that question and that consciousness they may not yet be prepared to understand, reveal or talk about. Hurting animals, it's animal protection issues, but also, environmental issues. So are you using chemicals that could hurt the environment? So that's sort of where we started. Do no harm. Are you hurting anything? And then that's sort of where the morality came in, Steve. And then it sort of merged into this sort of checklist of risk management, I think.
But it's also interesting that it is, when you say, what is ethics, you're now talking about the way in which there's a move in ethics committees, as I say, from looking perhaps originally at ethics now to risk management. But that there's never been more great philosophical work and sociological work on ethics. Look at Alain Badiou's work on ethics, for example. I must read. And again, I mentioned, one of the things we've been reading this week was actually Steve Hall's Socio-Economic Function of Evil, which is a great paper.
One of the best papers I've read in the last couple of years.
But absolutely central to that is the issue of, contextualised ethics and in modern neoliberalism. And I think that's what's really interesting. You've got a kind of banalisation of ethics committees at the same time as you've got all this really interesting work about ethics.
And I find that bizarre. I've been sitting through ethics committees really for the last 5-10 years, and saying sort of, really? Really? That's what you want to talk about? And minute after minute, half an hour after half an hour saying, really? That's what you want to talk about in relation to this project? Bizarre. So therefore, let's move to the second question, Steve, and talk about what is actually happening in ethics committees in universities at the moment. What is the story? You want to go back to the risk register conversation?
Yeah, I think so. That's certainly, as I say, I've been reading, criminology colleagues' work on this, and I think it's a more general problem than we've thought. That what you've got now is a move from what was general issues around methodology, protection of the researcher very often, a benevolent protection of the researcher, to what has become really a corporate issue around risk management. Universities in that sense are starting to become like other corporations. And of course we know that that's true in the neoliberal university. But that wasn't what ethics committees were about originally at all. But I can remember myself, working, say, at the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture when I set that up. We went to ethics committees at the height of ecstasy in Gunchester in Manchester. And we would actually howl at the way in which we were treated, going before those committees and looking where we were proposing our PhD students' ethnographies. Because the committees themselves just simply didn't understand. They didn't understand ecstasy or Gunchester for a start. So they didn't understand what the context of the work was, and therefore they couldn't really apply proper ethical principles, if you like. But they weren't talking about risk management in this way. That's 20 years ago, and there's been a huge shift from that, which I think was just simply not understanding what the thing was about, to a much more active risk management policy, which I think is what university ethics committees now apply in all disciplines. But they also marginalise, in my view, certain sorts of methodologies, and ethnography is one of them, because they then start to say ethnography is a problem. Yeah. Social science surveys are not a problem.
But what I find bizarre about this conversation, Steve, and let's use the work you did in Manchester as an example, which tens of thousands of people around the world have used, have read, have deployed in their lives. The morality, the ethics becomes involved in asking, right, well, acid house exists, ecstasy culture exists, dance culture exists, rave culture exists. Should a university pretend it doesn't exist and therefore not study it? There's an ethics to saying, well, if we don't study it, how will we understand it, and how will we actually make society better? Yes. So there is that's, for me, that's the ethics. If this isn't studied, what will happen? And
that was true, in my view, in practical ethics committees in universities in the past. I think we lost that. That's one of the things about the changes in university and the changes towards a neoliberal, much more corporate university. Round the world, this is global. But the sort of ethical issue that you've just raised was in fact the context of many university ethics committees in the 1970s, and in my experience being on both sides of the fence. Yeah,
and I mean, there are so many other examples of that. So not only drug and drug-taking cultures, but for example, male violence cultures.
Yeah,
the great question of that is, yes, there may be some danger to the researcher, and that obviously has to be discussed overtly and clearly, but what are the consequences of not understanding male violence?
Yeah, and there are loads of legal issues to do with that. And one of the things about ethnography, particularly as a method, is that very often the people who do it get accused of going native. And if you're looking at male violence cultures, for example, very often those ethnographers get accused of breaking the law, sympathising with particular male violence groups, hooligan groups, or whatever. And I think that literally does become a legal issue. I mean, if you're going to say, people are going to say to someone who's an ethnographer, you've gone native, that has all sorts of legal implications. So I think that's one of the things that had a background when the ethics committees were more cool and groovy, if you like.
Yeah, but also, what do we lose if the research isn't undertaken? For me, that is what ethics actually is.
But research now is so much more market-driven, corporate-driven, that you're not necessarily getting the same sorts of research through ethics committees that you used to.
I absolutely agree. And that leads to my next question, which again makes me bonkers on a daily basis. And the question is, and it is a loaded question, and I apologise to podcast listeners, but I'm cross. Why do you think we're maintaining the assumption of science research? And why is that, all scientists now, why are we applying the tenets, the truths, the tropes of science-based research to the humanities?
Well, I think that's been a long-term dominance, actually. I don't think that's something that's suddenly come up. And certainly in Australia, I moved to Australia 15 years ago, and I've seen that all the way through. Yeah. It may be getting worse, but it's certainly all the way through.
Yeah,
and also I think what you've got now is this, in my view, a mythology created around STEM subjects. So science, the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, maths, are now being seen as actually the privileged subjects. There have been policy makers in Australia, for example, saying that those students shouldn't pay fees. One of the Australian Labor Party proposals, for example. But that is not just in Australia. I think that kind of scientism, which is actually basically positivism and determinism, is dominating in all sorts of aspects of our academic life. The interesting thing is that the better science, actually, complexity theory, chaos theory and so on, doesn't actually appear in all this. So actually what you're being dominated is by incredibly crude, positivistic, deterministic scientism. And I think that's, it's one of the reasons why sociology developed so well in the 1960s and 70s around the world, because it was attacking that. We've got to attack it again, I think. So I don't think it's science as such. It's a particular version of science which is the problem.
And it has been embedded in the bureaucratisation of universities as well, Steve. Because what I'm finding is, I'm prepared to do the good fight and the humanities and the value of theoretical work, not apologising for theoretical work. But the problem is the forms we are filling in about research and the boxes that we're ticking off are assumptions about scientific methods and particular modes of, inverted commas, field work and stuff.
And they've dominated social science too. I think that's the interesting thing, that it's actually social science which has aped the more deterministic, positivistic sciences. So you've not just got it as a problem within science, you've actually got it in the whole areas of the social sciences, which is really where the battle is.
I agree. It's really over, I think you're right. Even though I'm in the high humanities, the debate is over social science first, I think, and then the high humanities will gain from that very, very difficult battle, I think, that has to be won.
Yes, I agree.
Now, the next question when we're dealing with ethics, I think, is a lot of these conversations we're having about risk management are analogue principles. They're for the analogue age, right? So how are we going to apply, manage, translate, transform these analogue principles for managing ethics to digital, publicly available social media sites like YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest? I'll explain to listeners why this is important. When we're on Facebook or when we're going on YouTube, the guys and gals have made an active, conscious, tick-a-box decision to upload that material and control to minutiae the audience for that work. So if we as researchers are assessing a YouTube video and its comments that are publicly available, and the decision has been made to make them publicly available, what remote ethic clearance would be required for that? That digital material has been made publicly available that researchers then access. So why would that investigation ever have to go to an ethics committee, Steve?
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things here is that ethics committees, and in fact the disciplines, have just not caught up with the digital age. Some really interesting work, which we mentioned before in some of the podcasts, Deborah Lupton's book on digital sociology, work in leisure studies, leisure cultures around the digital
ethnography.
Absolutely. There's some wonderful work going on out there, but actually the ethics committees and a lot of the gatekeepers of the disciplines actually haven't caught up with this at all. So they're not aware enough of how reflexive the good bits of the disciplines have become. But also they're just simply not aware of really what's involved in these sorts of things, to be honest. I think they've just not caught up, and they've got to.
Yeah, I mean, we've had crazy situations where someone's gone, "Oh, those sources are on the internet." They're on the internet. I mean, remember, the internet was formed in 1969. It is as old as I am. All those sources are on the internet. That has to be checked. Yeah. Well, you know, are you aware of Creative Commons licenses? Yes. Are you aware of, you know, public availability? You know, people. Are you aware on YouTube that you can actually click to make the comments publicly available? Yes. You can control them. So there's a great deal of consciousness in the people that are the creators of the Web 2 materials.
Yes. And I think there is a great deal of good work going on around the research into those things. I say in various disciplines, not just sociology or leisure studies, which have been the ones that I've looked at particularly, but that work is going to be very, very important because that will feed through into changes in ethics committees and changes in the gatekeepers of the discipline.
Yes, let's hope so. And of course, internet studies is another very powerful area here.
Absolutely.
And we need, of course, knowledge, you know, Mike
Kent's work. Absolutely.
And he's doing some fantastic work that I think, and I hope he listens to this podcast, he always does, but Mike, I hope you really think about how a lot of the work you're doing on the notion of the public can also have a functionality in our understanding of ethics in universities.
Yes. But I think there is a gap between that sort of work, which is really high quality, reflexive research work in the disciplines, and actually what, you know, real life ethics committees and real life gatekeepers of disciplines do. And there's a huge gap.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're calling it gatekeepers because I think that's exactly what's occurring.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, final question, and of course it's always about me because the final questions are always about me, Steve. What do you think is going to happen to archive rats like me? So what's going to happen to historians, people who work the analogue archive, work the digital archive? What's going to happen with us and our relationship with these ethics committees?
I think they've always been tangential.
Yeah.
So I think it's now it's perhaps more exposed than ever before, but actually, you know, there've always been a hierarchy of disciplines, and historians looking at the archive, oral historians in particular, you know, I've always been interested in that work, have always actually been marginalised and regarded sceptically, actually. So I don't think that's any different.
But see,
and there has to be a greater defence, maybe, of that work because it is certainly marginalised.
But I would also argue my fear is that your risk management ethics committees are starting to take over our work. I mean, I've certainly had people say to me, you know, "Oh, look, what are you doing? Oh, look, I'm going to the library and I'm doing that work. Oh, well, look, you've got to get ethics clearance for that." And I said, sorry, just to clarify, I'm walking into a library, sitting down, standing up, getting a book off a shelf and taking notes.
Yes.
What is the involvement of an ethics committee there again?
Yes, you're right, because the way in which ethics as a discipline has shifted to risk management, corporate risk management in particular, has meant that they can actually survey anything now.
Yeah, so that's the fear, and as you've rightly said, there's probably a very strong, good fight to be made over this question of ethics and bringing back the duty of care element for the researcher and for the participants and for the environment and for animals. That's crucial.
Yes, it is. And it's a legal duty of care anyway.
Yeah, rather than something else that is becoming risk management, but also, I think, as we've ended up here, surveillance.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve, for this powerful conversation. I'm feeling better.
Good.